In 1976, a respected high school math teacher vanished without a trace after teaching her final class before summer break, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the small town of Millbrook for nearly 2 decades. Patricia Coleman, 35, years old and beloved by students and colleagues alike, simply disappeared on that warm June afternoon, along with her distinctive blue sedan, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them both whole. But 18 years later, the guilt-ridden conscience of one woman would finally break, leading police to a discovery so shocking that it would forever change how this quiet community understood the true nature of the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight among them all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The last person to see Patricia Coleman alive was Janet Morrison, the school secretary, who watched through her office window as Patricia walked across the faculty parking lot toward her car at approximately 3:45 p.m. on June 18, 1976. Janet would later tell investigators that Patricia had seemed perfectly normal that afternoon, carrying her familiar brown leather briefcase and wearing the cheerful yellow dress that had become something of a trademark during her 7 years teaching at Millbrook High School. The two women had exchanged their usual pleasantries about summer vacation plans, with Patricia mentioning her intention to spend the evening organizing her classroom before the maintenance crew arrived the following week to strip and wax the floors. Patricia Coleman had built a reputation as one of the most dedicated educators in the district, arriving early each morning and often staying late into the evening to provide extra help to struggling students. Her colleagues described her as methodical and caring, someone who genuinely believed that every child could succeed in mathematics if given the proper guidance and encouragement. She lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, just 6 blocks from the school, a comfortable routine that had defined her life since moving to Millbrook 7 years earlier after completing her teaching degree at the state university. The investigation began almost immediately when Patricia failed to appear for a faculty meeting scheduled for the following morning. Principal Robert Henderson had been expecting all teachers to attend the end-of-year administrative session, and Patricia's absence struck him as completely out of character. When repeated phone calls to her home went unanswered, Henderson drove to her house personally, finding newspapers piling up on her front porch and mail overflowing from her mailbox. The spare key Patricia kept hidden under a flower pot near her back door revealed an undisturbed home, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Detective Ray Castellanos of the Millbrook Police Department took charge of the missing person case, beginning with a systematic examination of Patricia's daily routines and personal relationships. What emerged was the portrait of a woman whose life revolved entirely around her teaching career and a small circle of close friendships within the school community. She had no romantic entanglements that anyone knew of, no family conflicts, and no financial troubles that might have motivated a sudden departure. Her bank account showed modest but steady deposits from her teaching salary, with the last withdrawal being $20 taken 3 days before her disappearance for what appeared to be routine grocery shopping. The search for Patricia's blue sedan became a community-wide effort, with volunteers combing every back road, abandoned property, and secluded parking area within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. State police issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across 3 neighboring states, while local radio stations broadcast hourly updates asking citizens to report any sightings of the distinctive vehicle. Patricia drove a 1973 Chevrolet Chevelle, metallic blue with a small dent in the rear bumper from a minor parking lot incident the previous winter, making it easily identifiable to anyone who might encounter it. Days turned into weeks without any trace of either Patricia or her car. The investigation expanded to include interviews with every student she had taught during her tenure at Millbrook High School. Detective Castellanos methodically worked through class rosters, speaking with current and former students about their relationships with Patricia, searching for any hint of conflict or inappropriate behavior that might have led to her disappearance. What he found instead was a consistent pattern of testimonials about Patricia's fairness, kindness, and genuine investment in her students' academic success. Among the students interviewed was Tommy Morrison, a 17-year-old junior who had struggled significantly in Patricia's algebra class during the spring semester. Tommy's father, Frank Morrison, operated Morrison's Auto Repair and Salvage on the outskirts of town, a sprawling operation that included both a working garage and an extensive scrapyard filled with cannibalized vehicles and rusted machinery. Frank had built his business through a combination of mechanical expertise and an willingness to accept almost any automotive challenge, earning him a reputation as someone who could fix anything with four wheels and an engine. Tommy Morrison's academic difficulties had been a source of ongoing tension in the Morrison household throughout the spring semester. Frank Morrison, a man who had never progressed beyond ninth grade himself, nevertheless harbored ambitious dreams for his son's future, dreams that seemed increasingly threatened by Tommy's poor performance in mathematics and his growing association with a group of older students known for their rebellious attitudes and frequent truancy. Tommy's mother, Sarah Morrison, had initially approached Patricia Coleman privately to discuss additional tutoring options, hoping that one-on-one instruction might help her son grasp the algebraic concepts that continued to elude him in the regular classroom setting. The tutoring arrangement had begun in early May, with Tommy staying after school twice a week to work through problem sets under Patricia's patient guidance. According to the documentation Patricia kept meticulously in her grade book, Tommy had shown marked improvement during these sessions, his test scores climbing from failing grades to respectable C-level performance by the middle of June. Sarah Morrison had expressed her gratitude to Patricia during a chance encounter at the local grocery store just days before the teacher's disappearance, thanking her for the extra time and attention that seemed to be making such a positive difference in Tommy's academic trajectory. Frank Morrison himself had met Patricia Coleman only once, during a brief parent-teacher conference in April that Sarah had insisted he attend despite his general discomfort with school environments. Those who witnessed the meeting described Frank as polite but clearly uncomfortable, a man whose massive hands and oil-stained work clothes seemed incongruous in the neat, orderly environment of Patricia's classroom. He had listened quietly while Patricia explained Tommy's academic challenges and her recommendations for improvement, nodding occasionally, but contributing little to the conversation beyond expressing his hope that his son would graduate successfully. The following year, the Morrison family lived in a modest ranch house approximately 2 miles from Frank's scrapyard, in a neighborhood of working-class families where most breadwinners were employed either at the local paper mill or in various automotive-related businesses that served the trucking industry passing through on the nearby interstate highway. Frank Morrison had built his reputation through honest work and fair pricing, but neighbors occasionally complained about the noise from his scrapyard operations and the unsightly collection of rusted vehicles that seemed to grow larger each year despite his periodic efforts to haul away the most deteriorated hulks. The investigation into Patricia Coleman's disappearance continued through the summer of 1976. Detective Castellanos found himself returning repeatedly to the seemingly mundane details of her final day at school. Witnesses confirmed that she had conducted her regular classes without any apparent distress or unusual behavior, engaging with students in her typical encouraging manner and completing her end-of-semester grading with characteristic thoroughness. Her desk had been left in perfect order, with neatly stacked papers and carefully organized supplies suggesting that she had fully intended to return for the faculty meeting the following morning. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that Patricia had made several phone calls from her classroom during the lunch period on her final day, including one lengthy conversation with someone whose identity could not be immediately determined from the school's phone records. Janet Morrison, the school secretary, recalled seeing Patricia's line light up on the office switchboard, but had been too busy with end-of-year administrative tasks to pay close attention to the duration or nature of the call. This detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, would later assume greater importance as investigators struggled to piece together Patricia's final hours. Local newspaper coverage of the disappearance intensified public interest in the case, with the Millbrook Gazette publishing weekly updates throughout the summer and into the fall of 1976. Editor Margaret Walsh had known Patricia personally through their shared membership in the town's small but active book club, and her articles reflected both journalistic objectivity and genuine concern for a missing friend. The newspaper's coverage helped maintain community awareness of the case, but also generated numerous false leads as well-meaning citizens reported sightings of blue sedans and women matching Patricia's description in locations ranging from bus stations in distant cities to shopping centers hundreds of miles away. The investigation took on new urgency in August when Detective Castellanos received a report from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a blue sedan matching Patricia's car parked behind a roadside diner approximately 30 miles south of Millbrook on the evening of June 18th. The witness described seeing a woman who appeared distressed sitting in the driver's seat while a man leaned against the passenger side door, apparently engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. However, when investigators arrived at the diner to examine the location and interview employees, they found no corroborating evidence or additional witnesses who could confirm the sighting. Sarah Morrison found herself drawn into the community's collective anxiety about Patricia's disappearance, participating in search efforts and attending the prayer vigils that local churches organized throughout the summer. Her guilt about the situation extended beyond simple civic concern. She confided to her closest friend, because she couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia's kindness in tutoring Tommy had somehow contributed to whatever terrible fate had befallen the dedicated teacher. Sarah's attempts to discuss these feelings with Frank were met with dismissive reassurances that Patricia had probably simply decided to start a new life somewhere else, a theory that struck Sarah as completely inconsistent with everything she had observed about Patricia's character during their limited interactions. The autumn of 1976 brought no new developments in the case, despite Detective Castellanos' continued efforts to follow up on every potential lead and investigate every possible angle. The detective had developed a deep personal investment in solving Patricia's disappearance, driven partly by professional pride, but also by a growing conviction that the missing teacher had met with foul play rather than choosing to disappear voluntarily. His investigation files grew thicker with each passing month, filled with interview transcripts, witness statements, and detailed timelines that seemed to lead nowhere despite their meticulous documentation of every known fact about Patricia's final day to AS winter settled over Millbrook. The daily rhythm of life gradually returned to something approaching normalcy, though Patricia's empty classroom served as a constant reminder of the unsolved mystery that continued to haunt the school community. Her replacement, a young teacher, fresh from college, struggled to establish authority with students who frequently compared her methods unfavorably to Patricia's more experienced approach. The new teacher's frustration was understandable, colleagues agreed, but it also served to highlight just how significant Patricia's presence had been in the daily life of Millbrook High School. Tommy Morrison completed his junior year successfully, his improved mathematics grades serving as a lasting testament to Patricia's effective tutoring during those final weeks of her life. However, his academic success seemed to bring him little satisfaction, and teachers noticed that he had become increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative as the months passed. His parents attributed this change to the normal challenges of adolescence, but some faculty members wondered privately whether Tommy's personality shift might be connected to his tutor's mysterious disappearance. The first anniversary of Patricia's disappearance in June 1977 prompted renewed media attention and a fresh appeal from Detective Castellanos for anyone with information to come forward. The detective had exhausted most conventional investigative approaches, but he remained convinced that someone in the community possessed crucial knowledge about Patricia's fate that had not yet been revealed. His appeal generated several new tips, including reports from residents who claimed to have heard unusual noises or observed suspicious activity on the night of Patricia's disappearance. But none of these leads ultimately provided the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. Frank Morrison's Scrapyard continued to expand throughout the late 1970s, as his reputation for fair dealing and reliable service attracted customers from an increasingly wide geographic area. The business provided a comfortable living for his family, allowing Sarah to remain at home to focus on Tommy's education and the household management that Frank's demanding work schedule made difficult for him to handle personally. Neighbors occasionally remarked on the strange hours that Frank sometimes kept, arriving at his scrapyard very early in the morning or working late into the evening. But such dedication to his business seemed admirable rather than suspicious. In a community that valued hard work and entrepreneurial success, the investigation into Patricia Coleman's disappearance remained officially active, but by 1978 it had been relegated to the status of a cold case that Detective Castellanos reviewed, periodically without any realistic expectation of finding new evidence. The detective's frustration with the unsolved mystery had become a defining characteristic of his career, influencing his approach to subsequent investigations and reinforcing his conviction that patience and persistence were essential qualities for anyone hoping to achieve justice in difficult cases. His files on Patricia's disappearance filled 2 entire filing cabinets, representing hundreds of hours of investigative work that had failed to produce the answers that her friends and colleagues continued to seek. The years that followed Patricia Coleman's disappearance settled into a pattern of diminishing hope, punctuated by occasional flurries of renewed activity whenever someone claimed to have spotted her or her blue sedan in distant locations. Detective Castellanos maintained his methodical approach to the case, following up on every reported sighting no matter how improbable, but the leads invariably proved to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking by well-meaning citizens who wanted to believe that the beloved teacher might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or living under an assumed identity in a place where no one knew her tragic story. By 1980, Patricia's case had been featured in several true crime publications and even earned a brief segment on a national television program dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The increased exposure generated hundreds of tips from across the country, but none provided the breakthrough that investigators had hoped for. Detective Castellanos spent countless hours on long-distance phone calls, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in dozens of states to follow up on reports of women matching Patricia's description or vehicles resembling her distinctive blue Chevelle. But each investigation ended in disappointment and a growing sense that the truth might never be discovered. Tommy Morrison graduated from Millbrook High School in the spring of 1978, his final grades reflecting the academic improvement that had begun during his tutoring sessions with Patricia Coleman. However, instead of pursuing the college education that his improved performance had made possible, Tommy surprised his parents by announcing his intention to work full-time in his father's scrapyard business. Frank Morrison welcomed his son's decision, interpreting it as validation of the values of hard work and practical skills that he had tried to instill throughout Tommy's childhood. But Sarah Morrison felt troubled by what seemed like a deliberate abandonment of the educational opportunities that Patricia's patient instruction had helped create. The decision to join his father's business marked the beginning of a period when Tommy Morrison seemed to withdraw increasingly from social contact with his former classmates and childhood friends. Those who encountered him around town noticed that the outgoing, if sometimes rebellious, teenager had been replaced by a young man who seemed uncomfortable with casual conversation and quick to end interactions that might have led to deeper personal connections. His former teachers attributed this change to the natural maturation process that often occurred when young people entered the workforce, but some wondered privately whether Tommy's personality shift might be connected to unresolved feelings about his tutor's mysterious fate. Sarah Morrison's concerns about her son's emotional well-being were compounded by her growing awareness of the changes that had occurred in her husband's behavior since Patricia's disappearance. Frank had always been a man of few words, preferring action to conversation and showing affection through practical demonstrations rather than verbal expressions. But Sarah began to notice that he had become even more withdrawn and uncommunicative. As the months passed, he spent increasingly long hours at the scrapyard, often leaving home before dawn and returning well after dark, claiming that the expanding business required his constant attention to maintain the level of service that customers had come to expect. The Morrison family's financial situation improved significantly during the early 1980s as Frank's business continued to grow, allowing them to make substantial improvements to their home and purchase a newer car for Sarah's use. However, the material benefits of Frank's success seemed to bring little satisfaction to Sarah, who found herself feeling increasingly isolated in a marriage that had become characterized by polite but distant interactions and long periods of silence during which Frank seemed lost in thoughts that he was unwilling or unable to share with his wife. Detective Castellanos retired from the Millbrook Police Department in 1983, but not before ensuring that Patricia Coleman's case files were meticulously organized and documented for his successor. During his final interview with the local newspaper, Castellanos admitted that Patricia's disappearance represented the most frustrating failure of his law enforcement career, a case where he remained convinced that the truth existed somewhere within the community but had been successfully concealed by someone with both the means and the motivation to keep their secrets hidden. His replacement, Detective Maria Santos, inherited not only the case files but also Castellanos' conviction that Patricia's fate would eventually be revealed through patient investigative work and the gradual erosion of whatever factors were preventing witnesses from coming forward. The mid-1980s brought renewed attention to Patricia's case when her former colleagues at Millbrook High School organized a memorial scholarship fund in her honor, designed to provide financial assistance to students pursuing careers in mathematics education. The scholarship announcement generated considerable local media coverage, including interviews with Patricia's former students who had gone on to successful careers in fields requiring strong mathematical skills. Many of these alumni credited Patricia's teaching and encouragement with providing the foundation for their professional achievements, emphasizing the lasting impact that her brief career had made on the lives of countless young people. Tommy Morrison's transformation into a full-time employee of his father's scrapyard business coincided with a period of significant expansion for Morrison's auto repair and salvage. Frank Morrison had acquired additional property adjacent to his original location, allowing him to accommodate the growing inventory of vehicles and machinery that formed the core of his salvage operations. The expanded facility included several large storage buildings where Frank could house vehicles and equipment that required protection from the weather, as well as a sophisticated system of cataloging and organizing salvaged parts to make them easily accessible to customers seeking specific components. The success of Morrison's business attracted attention from automotive enthusiasts and professional mechanics throughout the region, who appreciated Frank's knack for locating hard-to-find parts and his willingness to undertake challenging restoration projects that other shops avoided. Frank's reputation for honesty and fair dealing had earned him a loyal customer base that included several law enforcement agencies that relied on his expertise to maintain their aging fleet vehicles within budget constraints. The irony of this professional relationship was lost on most observers, who saw only a successful businessman contributing to the community's economic vitality and public safety infrastructure. Sarah Morrison's growing unease about her family's situation was exacerbated by her increasing awareness of her son's apparent unhappiness despite the material security that his father's business success had provided. Tommy had developed a pattern of working long hours alongside Frank, but Sarah noticed that he seemed to derive little satisfaction from the work and often appeared distracted or troubled when he thought no one was observing him. Her attempts to engage Tommy in conversations about his future plans or personal interests were met with evasive responses that left her feeling even more concerned about his emotional well-being. The 10th anniversary of Patricia Coleman's disappearance in 1986 prompted another round of media coverage and community reflection on the unsolved mystery that continued to cast a shadow over Millbrook's sense of security and trust. Detective Santos organized a press conference to announce renewed investigative efforts, including plans to re-interview key witnesses and examine physical evidence using improved forensic techniques that had been developed since the original investigation. The announcement generated considerable public interest, but also seemed to increase the level of tension and anxiety among certain members of the community who had lived with the uncertainty surrounding Patricia's fate for an entire decade. Frank Morrison's response to the renewed investigative activity was to become even more reclusive and focused on his business operations, a reaction that Sarah attributed to his general discomfort with publicity and his preference for maintaining a low profile in community affairs. However, she also noticed that Frank seemed particularly agitated by news coverage of the case, changing television channels whenever reports about Patricia appeared and expressing irritation with what he characterized as unnecessary intrusion into private grief by media outlets more interested in sensationalism than genuine concern for the missing teacher's fate. The relationship between Frank and Sarah Morrison had evolved into something resembling a business partnership more than a marriage, with their interactions focused primarily on practical matters related to household management and financial planning. Sarah found herself increasingly dependent on her friendships with other women in the community for emotional support and meaningful conversation, but she was careful to avoid discussing her concerns about Frank's behavior or Tommy's apparent unhappiness, sensing that such revelations might invite questions that she was not prepared to answer. Tommy Morrison's social isolation became even more pronounced as he entered his 20s, with former classmates noting that he seemed uncomfortable at community events and quick to leave social gatherings that might have provided opportunities for the kind of casual interaction that most young adults enjoyed. His romantic relationships were brief and superficial, ending abruptly whenever they seemed to be developing into something more serious or emotionally intimate. Former girlfriends described Tommy as kind but distant, someone who seemed to be carrying emotional burdens that prevented him from fully engaging in normal social activities. The evolution of Morrison's auto repair and salvage during the late 1980s reflected Frank's increasingly sophisticated understanding of the automotive industry and his ability to anticipate market trends that other business owners missed. He had developed particular expertise in locating and refurbishing parts for vintage vehicles, a niche market that attracted customers from hundreds of miles away who were willing to pay premium prices for components that were no longer available through conventional commercial channels. This specialization required Frank to maintain extensive inventories of older vehicles, some of which had been stored in his facilities for years while he gradually cannibalized them for valuable parts. Detective Santos's renewed investigation into Patricia Coleman's disappearance included a systematic review of all physical evidence that had been collected during the original inquiry, as well as interviews with witnesses who had not been contacted for several years. The detective's methodical approach revealed several minor inconsistencies in witness statements that had not been apparent during the initial investigation, but none of these discrepancies seemed significant enough to suggest deliberate deception or to point toward any particular suspect or theory about Patricia's fate. The technological advances of the late 1980s offered new possibilities for investigating cold cases, including improved methods for analyzing trace evidence and enhanced computer databases that could be used to cross-reference information from multiple sources. Detective Santos took advantage of these developments to re-examine various aspects of Patricia's case, but the passage of time had degraded much of the physical evidence to the point where meaningful analysis was no longer possible. The detective's frustration with these limitations was evident in her detailed reports, which documented extensive efforts that yielded little new information despite representing hundreds of hours of investigative work. Sarah Morrison's internal struggle with her growing awareness of her family's secrets reached a crisis point during the late 1980s when she began to experience physical symptoms of stress that her doctor attributed to anxiety and depression. Her physician recommended counseling, but Sarah was reluctant to seek professional help that might require her to discuss the source of her emotional distress. Instead, she attempted to cope with her situation through increased involvement in church activities and volunteer work, hoping that service to others might provide some relief from the guilt and uncertainty that had begun to dominate her thoughts. The passage of time had done nothing to diminish Sarah's conviction that her husband and son were harboring knowledge about Patricia Coleman's disappearance that they had concealed from investigators and the community. Her suspicions were based not on any single piece of evidence, but rather on an accumulation of small observations and behavioral changes that had occurred following Patricia's disappearance. Frank's increased secrecy about his business activities, Tommy's withdrawal from social contact, and both men's obvious discomfort whenever Patricia's case was mentioned in conversation had created a pattern that Sarah found increasingly difficult to explain through innocent causes. The approaching end of the 1980s found Millbrook still haunted by the unsolved mystery of Patricia Coleman's disappearance, with the case having become part of the community's collective identity in ways that residents found both troubling and oddly comforting. The annual Memorial Scholarship Ceremony had evolved into a significant community event that brought together former students, retired teachers, and civic leaders to celebrate Patricia's legacy while acknowledging the continued absence of closure regarding her fate. These gatherings served multiple purposes, honoring a beloved teacher while also maintaining public awareness of an investigation that many community members believed would never be satisfactorily resolved. Frank Morrison's attendance at these memorial events was sporadic and brief, with Sarah often making excuses for his absence by citing business obligations or health concerns that prevented his participation. When Frank did attend, observers noted that he seemed uncomfortable and eager to leave, behavior that Sarah explained as reflecting his general discomfort with public gatherings rather than any specific reluctance to honor Patricia's memory. However, Sarah's own discomfort during these events was becoming increasingly apparent to her friends, who attributed her obvious distress to her natural empathy for Patricia's fate rather than to any personal knowledge that might be troubling her conscience. Tommy Morrison's complete avoidance of any community events related to Patricia Coleman had become so consistent that most residents simply accepted his absence as a natural characteristic of his reserved personality. However, a few of Patricia's former colleagues had begun to comment privately on what they perceived as Tommy's almost pathological avoidance of any situation where Patricia's name might be mentioned, behavior that seemed excessive even for someone who preferred to maintain a low social profile. These observations remained within the realm of casual speculation rather than serious suspicion, but they contributed to a growing sense among some community members that the Morrison family's relationship to Patricia's disappearance might be more complex than had been previously understood. The early 1990s brought subtle but significant changes to the Morrison family dynamic that would prove crucial to the eventual resolution of Patricia Coleman's case. Sarah Morrison had begun keeping a private journal, documenting her observations, and growing concerns about her husband and son's behavior in careful, measured prose that reflected both her determination to understand the truth and her fear of what that truth might reveal. The journal entries, written in her neat handwriting during quiet evening hours when Frank and Tommy were occupied with television or business matters, became Sarah's primary outlet for processing the emotional burden that had been steadily increasing since Patricia's disappearance nearly 15 years earlier. Detective Santos had developed her own theories about the Coleman case during her years of periodic review and investigation, theories that increasingly centered on the possibility that Patricia's disappearance involved someone within the immediate community rather than the random stranger violence that had been the focus of earlier investigative efforts. The detective's analysis of travel patterns, timing, and local knowledge required for successfully concealing both Patricia and her vehicle had led her to focus particular attention on individuals with access to automotive facilities and the technical expertise necessary for disposing of physical evidence in ways that would escape detection by conventional investigative methods. The expansion of Morrison's auto repair and salvage had continued throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, with Frank Morrison acquiring additional properties and equipment that transformed his operation into one of the region's most comprehensive automotive salvage facilities. The business now encompassed nearly 20 acres of carefully organized vehicle storage, multiple buildings for parts inventory and restoration work, and sophisticated equipment for processing vehicles that were beyond economical repair. Frank's reputation for efficiency and discretion had attracted commercial clients who valued his ability to handle large-scale vehicle disposal projects without creating regulatory complications or environmental concerns. Tommy Morrison's role in his father's business had evolved from general laborer to specialized technician, with particular expertise in vehicle dismantling and parts cataloging that made him valuable to customers seeking specific components for restoration projects. However, his professional competence seemed to provide little personal satisfaction, and those who interacted with him professionally noted that he approached his work with mechanical precision rather than the enthusiasm that might be expected from someone who had chosen to dedicate his career to the family business. His conversations with customers were brief and focused strictly on technical matters, avoiding the kind of casual social interaction that typically characterized business relationships in Millbrook's close-knit community. Sarah Morrison's involvement in community volunteer activities had increased significantly during the early 1990s, as she sought both purposeful activity and social connection to counterbalance the growing isolation she felt within her own family. Her work with the church food pantry and her participation in organizing community events provided opportunities for meaningful interaction with other women who appreciated her organizational skills and genuine concern for others' welfare. However, Sarah was careful to maintain boundaries in these relationships that prevented her new friends from gaining insights into her private concerns about her family's secrets. The 15th anniversary of Patricia Coleman's disappearance in 1991 marked a turning point in Detective Santos's approach to the case, as she decided to implement a more aggressive strategy focused on re-examining the alibis and statements of individuals who had been peripheral figures in the original investigation. This new approach included detailed reviews of business records, phone logs, and financial transactions that might reveal patterns or connections that had been overlooked during the initial inquiry when investigators were focused primarily on identifying obvious suspects or motives for Patricia's disappearance. Frank Morrison's business records from 1976 became part of Detective Santos's renewed investigation, along with similar documentation from other automotive businesses in the area that might have been involved in vehicle disposal or transportation during the relevant time period. Frank's cooperation with this process was complete and professional, providing access to all requested documentation and answering questions about his business operations during the summer of 1976 with what appeared to be genuine interest in assisting the investigation. However, Detective Santos noted that Frank seemed unusually well prepared for these inquiries, producing organized files and detailed records that suggested he had anticipated such questions and prepared comprehensive responses in advance. The detective's interview with Frank Morrison in late 1991 revealed a man who maintained careful control over his responses and demonstrated remarkable recall for specific details about his business activities 15 years earlier. Frank's explanations for his whereabouts and activities during the period surrounding Patricia's disappearance were comprehensive and seemed to account for all relevant time periods. But Detective Santos found herself troubled by what seemed like an almost rehearsed quality to his responses. The interview concluded without any significant revelations, but it reinforced the detective's growing conviction that the solution to Patricia's disappearance lay somewhere within the network of relationships and activities that had characterized Millbrook's small business community during the summer of 1976. Tommy Morrison's interview with Detective Santos proved more challenging, as the young man seemed uncomfortable with questions about his relationship with Patricia Coleman and his memories of the tutoring sessions that had occurred during the final weeks of her life. Tommy's responses were brief and factual, acknowledging Patricia's helpfulness and his gratitude for her extra attention to his academic difficulties, but avoiding any discussion of personal impressions or emotional responses to her disappearance. The detective noted that Tommy seemed particularly reluctant to discuss the specific content of his tutoring sessions or the circumstances surrounding their conclusion, deflecting such questions with vague references to the passage of time and the difficulty of remembering details from his teenage years. Sarah Morrison's interview with Detective Santos represented the most emotionally difficult aspect of the renewed investigation, as Sarah struggled to balance her desire to assist the inquiry with her growing fear that such cooperation might somehow implicate her family in Patricia's disappearance. Sarah's responses to questions about her memories of Patricia and the circumstances surrounding the tutoring arrangement were careful and measured, but the detective sensed an underlying tension that suggested Sarah might possess information that she was reluctant to reveal. The interview concluded with Detective Santos encouraging Sarah to contact her if any additional memories or observations came to mind, an invitation that would prove prophetic given the internal struggle that Sarah was experiencing. The psychological pressure on Sarah Morrison intensified throughout 1992 and 1993 as her awareness of her family's secrets became increasingly difficult to bear in isolation. Her journal entries from this period reflected growing desperation and confusion as she attempted to reconcile her love for her husband and son with her growing conviction that they possessed knowledge about Patricia's fate that they had concealed from investigators and the community. The entries also revealed Sarah's internal debate about her moral obligations, weighing her loyalty to her family against her sense of responsibility to Patricia's memory and the community's need for truth and closure. Frank Morrison's behavior during this period showed signs of increasing stress that were apparent to Sarah even though he continued to maintain his reserved and controlled public demeanor. Frank's sleep patterns had become erratic, with Sarah often finding him awake in the early morning hours, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and staring out the window toward his scrapyard in the distance. When questioned about these episodes, Frank would dismiss Sarah's concerns with explanations about business worries or minor health issues. But Sarah noted that his distraction and anxiety seemed to intensify whenever Patricia's case received renewed media attention or community discussion. Tommy Morrison's emotional state appeared to deteriorate significantly during the early 1990s, with his withdrawal from social contact becoming even more pronounced and his general demeanor reflecting what seemed like chronic depression or anxiety. Sarah's attempts to encourage Tommy to seek professional counseling or to discuss whatever was troubling him were met with defensive responses that effectively ended such conversations before they could develop into meaningful exchanges. Tommy's isolation had become so complete that Sarah began to worry about his long-term emotional and psychological well-being, fears that were compounded by her suspicions about the source of his obvious distress. The community's continued attention to Patricia Coleman's case, reflected in annual memorial events and periodic media coverage, created an environment where the Morrison family's behavioral patterns became increasingly noticeable to observant community members. Sarah's obvious discomfort during public events that mentioned Patricia, combined with Frank and Tommy's consistent avoidance of such gatherings, began to generate subtle speculation among some residents who had known the family for many years. However, this speculation remained within the realm of casual observation rather than serious suspicion, as most community members attributed the Morrison family's behavior to their generally private nature rather than to any specific knowledge about Patricia's disappearance. Detective Santos's investigation had expanded to include detailed analysis of geographical patterns and logistical factors that would have been relevant to successfully concealing both Patricia and her vehicle for such an extended period. The detectives' research into local businesses with the capability and opportunity to dispose of vehicles without creating official records or attracting regulatory attention had identified several potential locations, including Morrison's Auto Repair and Salvage, but had not yet produced sufficient evidence to justify more intensive investigation of any particular facility. The detective's frustration with the slow pace of progress was evident in her detailed case notes, which documented extensive investigative efforts that had yielded important insights about the case's probable characteristics without identifying specific suspects or evidence. The approaching 17th anniversary of Patricia's disappearance in 1993 coincided with significant changes in Detective Santos's personal life that would influence her approach to the case during its final phase. The detective's impending retirement had created urgency about resolving the investigation before responsibility transferred to another investigator who would lack her accumulated knowledge and insights about the case's complexities. Detective Santos had begun working longer hours and pursuing more aggressive investigative strategies, including surveillance activities and informal interviews with community members who might possess relevant information without realizing its significance. Sarah Morrison's internal crisis reached a breaking point during the winter of 1993-94 when a combination of factors converged to make her situation unbearable. Her physician had begun expressing concern about her chronic anxiety and depression, recommending more intensive treatment that would require Sarah to discuss the sources of her emotional distress. Simultaneously, her involvement in church activities had brought her into contact with Patricia's elderly mother, who had moved to Millbrook to be closer to the site of her daughter's disappearance and who spoke frequently about her continued hope that Patricia's fate would eventually be revealed. These encounters forced Sarah to confront the human cost of her family's secrets in ways that made continued silence seem morally impossible. The breaking point came during a chance encounter at the grocery store in March 1994 when Sarah found herself in conversation with Janet Morrison, the former school secretary who had been the last person to see Patricia alive. Janet's casual mention of her continued prayers for Patricia's soul and her hope that Patricia's family would someday find peace created an emotional response in Sarah that she could barely control. The conversation concluded with Sarah excusing herself abruptly and rushing home, where she spent the afternoon in her bedroom, overwhelmed by the realization that she could no longer maintain her silence about what she suspected her family had done. Frank Morrison's reaction to Sarah's obvious distress that evening revealed the extent to which he had been monitoring his wife's emotional state and her interactions with community members who might discuss Patricia's case. Frank's questions about Sarah's activities and conversations were more direct and persistent than usual, suggesting that he recognized the potential threat that Sarah's emotional instability posed to whatever secrets he and Tommy had been protecting. The confrontation that followed was the most direct discussion of Patricia's disappearance that had ever occurred within the Morrison household, though it consisted primarily of Frank's warnings about the dangers of speculation and gossip rather than any admission of specific knowledge about Patricia's fate. Tommy Morrison's presence during this confrontation revealed the extent to which he shared his father's concerns about Sarah's emotional stability and her potential to disrupt whatever arrangement had allowed them to maintain their secrets for nearly 18 years. Tommy's participation in warning Sarah about the consequences of discussing family matters with outsiders demonstrated that he was fully aware of the stakes involved and committed to maintaining the silence that had protected them for so long. However, the confrontation also revealed the psychological toll that this burden had taken on Tommy, whose obvious anxiety and emotional fragility suggested that he might be approaching his own breaking point. The weeks following this confrontation were characterized by increased tension within the Morrison household, as Frank and Tommy became more vigilant about Sarah's activities while Sarah struggled with the growing conviction that she could no longer participate in what she had come to understand as a massive deception that had deprived Patricia's family and the community of truth and closure. Sarah's journal entries from this period reflected her internal debate about the consequences of breaking her silence, weighing her fear of destroying her family against her growing certainty that continued silence was morally indefensible. The final catalyst for Sarah's decision to contact Detective Santos came in early April 1994, when Sarah discovered a newspaper clipping about Patricia's case that Frank had hidden in his desk drawer, along with other materials that suggested he had been following the investigation's progress much more closely than he had ever admitted to Sarah or the investigators. The discovery of this evidence confirmed Sarah's worst fears about her family's involvement in Patricia's disappearance and eliminated any remaining doubt about the necessity of revealing what she suspected to the authorities, regardless of the personal consequences that such revelations might bring to her marriage and her relationship with her son. The decision to contact Detective Santos represented the most difficult choice of Sarah Morrison's life, a decision that she postponed repeatedly during the late spring of 1994 as she wrestled with the competing loyalties and moral obligations that had come to define her existence. Her journal entries from this period revealed a woman trapped between her love for her family and her growing conviction that justice for Patricia Coleman required her to break the silence that had protected Frank and Tommy for nearly 18 years. Each day brought new internal arguments as Sarah considered the potential consequences of her revelation, weighing the certain destruction of her marriage and family relationships against what she had come to understand as her moral responsibility to Patricia's memory and the community's need for truth. The hidden newspaper clipping that Sarah had discovered in Frank's desk became a constant source of torment, representing concrete evidence that her husband had been monitoring the investigation's progress while simultaneously maintaining his public posture of casual concern and limited knowledge about Patricia's disappearance. The clipping, which detailed Detective Santos's renewed investigative efforts and included quotes about the case remaining active despite the passage of time, had been carefully preserved alongside other materials that suggested Frank's interest in the case extended far beyond what would be expected from an ordinary community member with no special connection to Patricia or her fate. Sarah's attempts to maintain normal family routines during this period became increasingly strained as she struggled to interact naturally with Frank and Tommy while harboring knowledge that fundamentally altered her understanding of their characters and their relationship to the community's most enduring mystery. Conversations at family meals became stilted and uncomfortable, with Sarah finding herself unable to engage in casual discussion while simultaneously analyzing every comment for potential revelations about the secrets that she suspected they were harboring. Frank and Tommy seemed to sense the change in Sarah's demeanor, responding with their own increased wariness and careful attention to her emotional state. The psychological pressure on Sarah intensified when she realized that her discovery of the hidden materials meant that Frank would eventually become aware of her knowledge, creating a timeline for her decision that was determined by factors beyond her control. Sarah understood that Frank's meticulous nature and attention to detail would eventually lead him to check his hiding place and discover that the materials had been disturbed, at which point her window of opportunity for voluntary disclosure would close and be replaced by a more dangerous dynamic where Frank might take active steps to prevent her from revealing what she suspected. Detective Santos had continued her methodical review of the Coleman case throughout 1994, focusing particular attention on businesses and individuals with the capability and opportunity to dispose of vehicles and other physical evidence without creating official records or attracting regulatory attention. The detective's analysis had identified several potential scenarios for Patricia's disappearance, most of which involved local perpetrators with specialized knowledge of automotive systems and access to facilities where evidence could be concealed for extended periods. This investigative focus had naturally led to increased scrutiny of businesses like Morrison's Auto Repair and Salvage, though Detective Santos remained careful to avoid premature conclusions that might compromise her ability to gather evidence. Through conventional investigative methods, the detective's periodic surveillance of Morrison's scrapyard had revealed operational patterns that seemed consistent with legitimate business activities, but had also identified several aspects of Frank Morrison's procedures that seemed unusual for a typical automotive salvage operation. Detective Santos noted that Frank appeared to maintain more extensive security measures than would be expected for a business of his type, including surveillance cameras and restricted access procedures that seemed designed to prevent casual observation of his activities. Additionally, Frank's practice of working alone during evening and weekend hours was inconsistent with the collaborative approach that characterized most successful automotive repair operations. Sarah Morrison's final decision to contact Detective Santos was precipitated by a conversation with Patricia's elderly mother during a chance encounter at the post office in late May 1994. The older woman's continued grief and her expressions of hope that Patricia's fate would eventually be revealed created an emotional response in Sarah that made continued silence seem like active participation in prolonging an innocent woman's suffering. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it crystallized Sarah's understanding of the human cost of her family's secrets and eliminated her remaining doubts about the necessity of revealing what she suspected to the authorities. The phone call to Detective Santos on the evening of May 31st, 1994, represented the culmination of Sarah Morrison's months-long internal struggle and the beginning of the final phase of the investigation into Patricia Coleman's disappearance. Sarah's voice was barely audible as she identified herself and requested a private meeting to discuss information that might be relevant to the case, information that she characterized as extremely sensitive and potentially dangerous to reveal. Detective Santos recognized the significance of the call immediately, understanding that 18 years of investigation had potentially reached a turning point that would require careful handling to avoid compromising whatever revelations Sarah Morrison might be prepared to offer. The meeting between Detective Santos and Sarah Morrison took place 3 days later in a small office at the county courthouse, chosen for its privacy and security rather than its comfort or convenience. Sarah arrived early and waited nervously in the hallway, clutching a manila envelope that contained photocopies of the materials she had discovered in Frank's desk, along with selected pages from her personal journal documenting her observations and concerns about her family's behavior. The detective's initial impression was of a woman who had been carrying an enormous emotional burden for an extended period and who was simultaneously relieved and terrified by the prospect of finally sharing that burden with someone who could take appropriate action. Sarah's account of her suspicions unfolded slowly and carefully, with the detective asking minimal questions and allowing Sarah to present her information in whatever sequence felt most comfortable. The narrative that emerged was not one of witnessed crimes or overheard confessions, but rather a detailed description of behavioral patterns, emotional responses, and circumstantial evidence that had accumulated over nearly 2 decades to create a compelling case for further investigation. Sarah's documentation was meticulous, and her observations were presented with the kind of careful analysis that reflected months of private investigation and emotional processing. The hidden newspaper clippings and related materials that Sarah had discovered provided concrete evidence of Frank Morrison's intense interest in the investigation's progress, an interest that seemed inconsistent with his public posture of limited concern and casual cooperation with investigators. Detective Santos recognized that these materials, combined with Sarah's detailed observations about her family's behavioral patterns, created sufficient justification for more intensive investigation of the Morrison family's potential involvement in Patricia's disappearance. However, the detective also understood that the delicate nature of Sarah's position as both informant and potential victim required careful planning to ensure her safety while gathering additional evidence. The investigation strategy that Detective Santos developed following her meeting with Sarah Morrison reflected both the promising nature of the new information and the complex legal and ethical considerations involved in investigating individuals who had maintained their innocence for nearly 2 decades. The detective's approach emphasized surveillance and evidence-gathering techniques that would not immediately alert Frank and Tommy Morrison to the renewed focus on their activities, while simultaneously developing contingency plans to protect Sarah Morrison if her role as informant became known to her family members before the investigation could be completed. Sarah Morrison's cooperation with the investigation required her to maintain normal family routines while simultaneously documenting any additional evidence or suspicious behavior that might support the case against Frank and Tommy. This double life created enormous psychological pressure for Sarah, who found herself analyzing every interaction with her family members for potential significance while struggling to avoid behavioral changes that might alert them to her cooperation with the authorities. The detective provided Sarah with specific guidance about documentation procedures and safety protocols, but ultimately Sarah was operating in an extremely dangerous situation where discovery could have severe personal consequences. The technical aspects of investigating Morrison's auto repair and salvage presented unique challenges that required Detective Santos to coordinate with specialists in automotive forensics and environmental investigation. The sheer size and complexity of Frank Morrison's operation meant that any comprehensive search would require extensive resources and careful planning to ensure that all potential evidence was properly identified and preserved. Additionally, the passage of nearly 18 years since Patricia's disappearance meant that any physical evidence would have deteriorated significantly and might require sophisticated laboratory analysis to yield meaningful results. Frank Morrison's increasing paranoia during the summer of 1994 became apparent to both Sarah and the surveillance team that Detective Santos had positioned around the scrapyard and the Morrison family residence. Frank's behavior suggested that he suspected increased police attention, though it was unclear whether this suspicion was based on specific observations or simply the natural anxiety of someone who had been concealing criminal activity for an extended period. His modifications to his daily routines and his implementation of additional security measures at the scrapyard suggested that he was preparing for the possibility of official investigation while hoping to avoid detection through careful operational procedures. Tommy Morrison's psychological deterioration accelerated during this period, with his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and his emotional state showing signs of severe stress that were apparent even to casual observers. His isolation from social contact had become so complete that former acquaintances began to comment on his obvious distress and his apparent inability to engage in normal interpersonal relationships. Sarah's observations of Tommy's condition were documented in her continuing reports to Detective Santos, providing evidence of the psychological toll that concealing their secrets had taken on both men over the years. The breakthrough in the investigation came in early August 1994 when Detective Santos' surveillance team observed Frank Morrison engaging in unusual activity at his scrapyard during the pre-dawn hours, activity that appeared to involve the systematic movement and reorganization of vehicles and equipment in ways that suggested preparation for some type of significant operational change. The surveillance footage captured Frank working alone with specialized equipment to relocate several vehicles that had been stored in a remote section of the scrapyard for what appeared to be an extended period. Behavior that was consistent with someone attempting to conceal or eliminate evidence before anticipated official scrutiny. The decision to obtain search warrants for Morrison's auto repair and salvage was made following consultation with the district attorney's office and careful review of all available evidence. including Sarah Morrison's detailed documentation and the surveillance footage that suggested Frank Morrison was actively attempting to conceal or destroy potential evidence. Detective Santos understood that the search would represent the culmination of nearly 2 decades of investigation and that the results would either vindicate her theories about the case or eliminate one of the most promising leads that had been developed during her tenure on the investigation. Sarah Morrison's emotional state. During the final weeks before the search was characterized by a mixture of relief and terror as she anticipated the revelation of whatever secrets her family had been concealing while simultaneously fearing the personal consequences that such revelations would bring to her marriage and her relationship with her son. Her journal entries from this period reflected her conviction that she had made the correct moral choice, while acknowledging the likelihood that her decision would result in the destruction of everything that had defined her adult life. The detectives' assurances about witness protection and support services provided some comfort, but could not eliminate Sarah's awareness that she was about to lose her family and her community identity regardless of what the investigation ultimately revealed. The final surveillance activities before the execution of the search warrant revealed Frank Morrison's desperation as he worked frantically during nighttime hours to complete whatever evidence concealment or destruction he had been attempting. The surveillance team observed him using heavy equipment to excavate and relocate materials within the scrapyard, activity that seemed focused on a particular section of the property that had been off-limits to customers and employees for many years. Frank's obvious exhaustion and erratic behavior suggested that he understood the investigation was approaching a critical phase and that his window of opportunity for concealing evidence was rapidly closing. Tommy Morrison's complete psychological breakdown occurred during the final week before the search, with Sarah reporting that her son had become nearly catatonic and unable to maintain even basic daily routines. His condition suggested that he was no longer capable of assisting Frank with whatever evidence concealment efforts were underway, leaving Frank to manage the crisis alone while dealing with his own psychological pressure and the increasing certainty that their secrets would soon be revealed. Sarah's reports about Tommy's condition influenced Detective Santos's decision to coordinate with mental health professionals who could provide appropriate support when the investigation reached its conclusion and Tommy's role in Patricia's disappearance was finally revealed. The search warrant for Morrison's auto repair and salvage was executed on August 15, 1994, exactly 18 years, 1 month, and 28 days after Patricia Coleman had disappeared following her final class before summer break. Detective Santos had assembled a team of specialists including automotive forensics experts, environmental investigators, and archaeological technicians who were prepared to conduct a comprehensive examination of the facility and its contents. The scale and complexity of the planned search reflected both the enormous size of Frank Morrison's operation and the recognition that nearly 2 decades of concealment had created investigative challenges that would require sophisticated technical approaches to overcome. Frank Morrison's arrest occurred simultaneously with the beginning of the search, as Detective Santos and her team had determined that allowing him to remain at liberty during the investigation would create unacceptable risks for both evidence preservation and public safety. Frank's response to the arrest was surprisingly calm, suggesting that he had been anticipating this moment for years and had mentally prepared himself for the inevitable conclusion of his efforts to conceal his crimes. His requests for legal representation were handled through standard procedures, but his general demeanor suggested resignation rather than the defiance or denial that typically characterized suspects who maintained their innocence. The early hours of the search focused on areas of the scrapyard that surveillance had identified as recent focuses of Frank Morrison's attention, particularly the remote section where he had been observed moving vehicles and excavating materials during nighttime operations. The investigative team's systematic approach revealed evidence of extensive efforts to alter the landscape and conceal whatever materials Frank had been attempting to hide, efforts that had clearly consumed considerable time and resources over many years. The sophistication of the concealment method suggested that Frank had been planning for the possibility of official investigation throughout the entire period since Patricia's disappearance, the discovery that would finally solve the mystery of Patricia Coleman's disappearance came late in the afternoon of the first day of searching, When forensic specialists working in the remote section of the scrapyard identified structural evidence that had been concealed beneath layers of dirt, debris, and carefully arranged salvage materials that were clearly intended to prevent detection. Through casual observation or even routine official inspection, the forensic team's discovery of structural evidence beneath the carefully arranged concealment materials marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of the investigation. As specialists worked with painstaking precision to document and preserve whatever Frank Morrison had spent nearly 2 decades attempting to hide from detection. The methodical excavation process required hours of careful work to remove layers of debris and salvage materials without compromising the integrity of whatever lay beneath, a process that was complicated by Frank's sophisticated understanding of evidence preservation and his apparent efforts to create multiple barriers to discovery even if the initial concealment was penetrated. Detective Santos coordinated the excavation activities while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of maintaining security around the search site and handling the growing media attention that the arrest and search had generated throughout the community. The detectives' awareness that they were potentially approaching the solution to Millbrook's most enduring mystery created enormous pressure to ensure that all evidence was properly handled and documented, as any procedural errors could compromise the prosecution of whatever crimes the investigation ultimately revealed. The stakes involved in the search were evident in the careful coordination between multiple agencies and the extensive resources that had been committed to ensuring a comprehensive and legally sound investigation. Sarah Morrison's emotional state during the search represented a complex mixture of relief, terror, and anticipation as she waited for confirmation of the suspicions that had tormented her for years. Her cooperation with the investigation had placed her in protective custody for her own safety, but her isolation from the community and her family during this critical period added another layer of emotional difficulty to an already overwhelming situation. The detectives' periodic updates about the search's progress provided some comfort, but could not eliminate Sarah's awareness that she was about to learn definitively whether her husband and son were responsible for the crimes she had suspected them of committing. Frank Morrison's behavior in custody reflected the psychological complexity of someone who had maintained an elaborate deception for nearly 2 decades while simultaneously preparing mentally for the possibility that his crimes would eventually be discovered. His interactions with investigators and legal counsel suggested a man who was simultaneously relieved that his burden of secrecy was ending and terrified about the consequences that revelation would bring to his family and his community standing. Frank's detailed knowledge of legal procedures and evidence requirements suggested that he had spent considerable time over the years researching the potential consequences of discovery and preparing for the legal challenges that would follow. His eventual arrest, Tommy Morrison's psychological condition had deteriorated to the point where he required medical supervision and psychological support to maintain basic functionality, a situation that complicated the investigation's approach to determining his role in whatever crimes had been committed. His complete emotional breakdown suggested that he had been carrying an enormous burden of guilt and fear for most of his adult life, a burden that had prevented him from developing normal relationships or achieving the kind of personal satisfaction that would typically be expected from someone his age. The medical professionals working with Tommy reported that his condition was consistent with someone who had been traumatized by participation in or knowledge of serious criminal activity during his formative years, the excavation process revealed. Evidence of extensive planning and sophisticated concealment methods that demonstrated Frank Morrison's technical expertise and his understanding of investigative procedures that might be used to locate hidden evidence. The layers of materials that had been used to conceal whatever lay beneath reflected careful consideration of factors, including drainage, structural stability, and visual concealment that suggested Frank had devoted considerable thought and resources to ensuring that his secrets would remain hidden indefinitely. The sophistication of the concealment methods also suggested that Frank had been motivated by more than simple panic or desperation, instead indicating a calculated effort to create multiple barriers to discovery even under intensive investigation. The community's reaction to the arrest and search created a complex dynamic of shock, relief, and uncertainty as residents struggled to process the possibility that Patricia Coleman's disappearance might finally be solved after nearly 2 decades of speculation and investigation. The Morrison family's long-standing reputation as respected community members made the allegations difficult for many residents to accept, while others expressed relief that the mystery might finally be resolved regardless of the personal cost to individuals they had known and trusted for years. The media attention generated by the search brought reporters and television crews from regional and national outlets, creating a circus atmosphere that added stress to an already emotionally charged situation. The technical challenges involved in excavating and documenting evidence that had been concealed for 18 years required coordination between multiple forensic specialties and careful attention to preservation procedures that would ensure the admissibility of whatever was discovered. The deterioration that would naturally occur over such an extended period meant that even significant evidence might be in extremely fragile condition and require sophisticated laboratory analysis to yield meaningful results. The forensic team's approach emphasized documentation and preservation over speed, recognizing that the importance of the potential discovery justified whatever time and resources were necessary to ensure that no crucial evidence was lost or compromised through hasty procedures. Detective Santos's management of the investigation during this critical phase reflected her understanding that the success or failure of nearly 2 decades of investigative work would be determined by the thoroughness and precision of the search activities currently underway. The detectives' coordination with specialists from multiple agencies ensured that all aspects of the investigation were being handled by individuals with appropriate expertise, while her oversight of the overall process maintained the consistency and legal integrity that would be essential for any subsequent prosecution. The pressure associated with managing such a high-profile investigation was evident in Detective Santos's intensive involvement in every aspect of the search and her careful attention to procedural details that might seem minor but could prove crucial during trial proceedings. The psychological impact of the investigation on the broader community extended beyond simple curiosity about the case's resolution to include more complex questions about trust, security, and the reliability of long-held assumptions about community members and their character. Patricia Coleman's disappearance had been a defining element of Millbrook's collective identity for 18 years, and the possibility that it might be solved through the revelation of crimes committed by respected community members created cognitive dissonance that many residents found difficult to process. The investigation forced community members to reconsider their understanding of people they had known and trusted for decades, a process that was particularly challenging for those who had personal or professional relationships with the Morrison family. The evidence preservation procedures employed during the search reflected current best practices in forensic investigation, but also acknowledged the unique challenges associated with evidence that had been deliberately concealed for an extended period by someone with technical expertise and access to specialized equipment. The forensic team's approach included photographic documentation at every stage of the excavation process, careful cataloging of all materials encountered, and specialized handling procedures designed to maximize the potential for laboratory analysis of degraded materials. The comprehensive documentation would be essential not only for prosecution purposes, but also for providing definitive answers to the community and Patricia's family about what had happened during those final hours of her life. Frank Morrison's legal strategy, as it emerged through his interactions with court-appointed counsel, seemed to focus on minimizing his culpability rather than maintaining innocence, suggesting that he understood the strength of the evidence that was likely to be revealed through the search process. His cooperation with certain aspects of the investigation, combined with his apparent reluctance to discuss specific details about Patricia's disappearance, created a complex dynamic that investigators found challenging to interpret. Frank's behavior suggested someone who was resigned to facing consequences for his actions, while still hoping to limit the extent of those consequences through strategic cooperation and careful management of the information he provided to authorities. The ongoing excavation work revealed additional evidence of the extensive efforts that Frank Morrison had undertaken to conceal his crimes, including evidence of multiple phases of concealment activity that had occurred over the years since Patricia's disappearance. The layered nature of the concealment suggested that Frank had periodically returned to the site to implement additional security measures, possibly in response to investigative activities or community discussions that had heightened his concerns about potential discovery. This pattern of ongoing concealment efforts demonstrated the enormous psychological burden that Frank had been carrying and the constant anxiety that had characterized his life since committing whatever crimes the investigation was in the process of revealing. Sarah Morrison's detailed knowledge of her family's behavioral patterns proved invaluable to investigators as they worked to understand the timeline and logistics of whatever had occurred during Patricia's disappearance. Sarah's observations about changes in Frank and Tommy's behavior, their work schedules, and their emotional states provided crucial context for interpreting the physical evidence that was being uncovered during the search. Her cooperation with the investigation had required enormous personal courage, as she understood that her revelations would result in the destruction of her family relationships and her social standing within the community, regardless of whatever legal protections might be available to her. The search team's discovery of automotive components and materials that appeared to be related to vehicle dismantling operations focused investigative attention on Frank Morrison's specialized knowledge and the sophisticated equipment that his business operations had provided for concealing evidence. The presence of these materials in areas that had been carefully concealed suggested that Frank had used his professional expertise and business resources to dispose of evidence in ways that would be extremely difficult to detect through conventional investigative methods. The sophistication of the concealment methods also indicated that Frank had been thinking strategically about evidence disposal from the very beginning of whatever criminal activity he had undertaken. Tommy Morrison's role in the concealment activities remained unclear as investigators worked to determine the extent of his knowledge and participation in whatever crimes had been committed. His psychological condition made it difficult to obtain reliable information about his involvement, but the evidence suggested that he had been aware of his father's activities and had participated in at least some aspects of the concealment efforts over the years. The investigation's approach to Tommy was complicated by his obvious mental health issues and the recognition that he had been a minor at the time of Patricia's disappearance, factors that would influence both his legal culpability and the investigative strategies that could be appropriately employed. The forensic analysis of materials recovered during the search required coordination with specialized laboratories and experts who could provide definitive identification and analysis of evidence that had deteriorated significantly over the 18 years since its concealment. The complexity of this analysis process meant that definitive results would not be available for several weeks or months, creating a period of uncertainty and speculation that would be difficult for all parties involved. However, the preliminary analysis of certain materials had already provided strong indications about the nature of what had been concealed and the crimes that Frank Morrison would ultimately be charged with committing. The community's emotional response to the ongoing investigation reflected the complex mixture of relief and betrayal that characterized their processing of the possibility that Patricia's disappearance had finally been solved through the revelation of crimes committed by individuals they had trusted and respected. Local churches organized prayer services and support groups for community members struggling to process the implications of the investigation, while businesses and civic organizations grappled with questions about how to respond to the potential conviction of someone who had been an active and respected member of the community for decades. The investigation forced Millbrook to confront difficult questions about trust, judgment, and the possibility that evil could exist undetected within even close-knit communities. Detective Santos's coordination of the investigation's final phases required careful attention to legal procedures and evidence handling requirements that would be essential for successful prosecution of whatever charges would ultimately be filed. The detective's experience with complex criminal cases had prepared her for the logistical and procedural challenges involved in managing such an extensive investigation, but the personal investment she had developed in solving Patricia's case created additional pressure to ensure that every aspect of the investigation was handled with maximum professionalism and attention to detail. The detective understood that the community's need for closure and justice depended on the thoroughness and legal integrity of the work being conducted during these critical weeks. The media attention surrounding the investigation created additional complications as reporters and television crews sought access to information and individuals involved in the case, sometimes interfering with investigative activities and creating security concerns that required careful management. Detective Santos's approach to media relations emphasized transparency about procedural matters while protecting the integrity of the ongoing investigation and the privacy of individuals who were cooperating with authorities. The balance between public interest and investigative necessity required constant attention and frequent coordination with prosecutors and public information officers who could provide appropriate updates without compromising the case. The psychological support services that had been provided to Sarah Morrison and other individuals affected by the investigation reflected recognition that the resolution of Patricia's case would create emotional challenges that extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Sarah's cooperation with the investigation had required her to betray fundamental loyalties and relationships that had defined her adult life, a decision that would have lasting consequences regardless of whatever legal protections or support services might be available. The investigation's impact on Sarah illustrated the complex human costs associated with concealed crimes and the courage required from individuals who choose to reveal family secrets that have been maintained for decades. The final phases of the excavation work revealed the full extent of Frank Morrison's concealment efforts and provided investigators with a comprehensive understanding of the planning and resources that had been devoted to hiding evidence of his crimes for nearly 2 decades. The sophistication and thoroughness of the concealment methods demonstrated Frank's technical expertise and his understanding of investigative procedures, but also revealed the enormous psychological burden that maintaining such elaborate deceptions had placed on him and his family over the years. The evidence suggested that Frank had anticipated the possibility of discovery from the very beginning and had implemented multiple layers of concealment that were designed to delay or prevent successful investigation even under intensive scrutiny. The preparation for formal charges against Frank Morrison required careful coordination between investigators, forensic specialists, and prosecutors to ensure that all available evidence was properly documented and legally admissible. The complexity of the case, combined with the passage of nearly 2 decades since the original crimes, created unique challenges that required expertise in both current legal procedures and historical investigative methods. The prosecution team's approach emphasized thorough preparation and conservative charging decisions that would maximize the likelihood of successful conviction while ensuring that all aspects of Frank's criminal activity were appropriately addressed through the legal system. The comprehensive forensic analysis of materials recovered from Morrison's scrapyard required coordination with multiple specialized laboratories across the region, each facility contributing specific expertise to the complex process of analyzing evidence that had been deliberately concealed for nearly 2 decades. The deterioration that had occurred during the extended period of concealment meant that even sophisticated analysis techniques would be challenged to produce definitive results. But the preliminary examinations had already provided strong indications about the nature and significance of what had been discovered. Detective Santos worked closely with forensic coordinators to ensure that all materials were properly prioritized and that the most critical analyses were completed as quickly as possible while maintaining the rigorous standards necessary for courtroom presentation. Frank Morrison's psychological evaluation, conducted as part of the standard procedures following his arrest, revealed a complex personality profile that helped explain how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for such an extended period while continuing to function as a respected member of the community. The evaluation suggested that Frank possessed above-average intelligence combined with sophisticated planning abilities and an unusual capacity for compartmentalization that had allowed him to separate his criminal activities from his public persona. However, the psychological assessment also revealed significant underlying anxiety and depression that had been present throughout the years since Patricia's disappearance, conditions that had been carefully concealed from family members and community associates through considerable personal effort. Tommy Morrison's condition continued to deteriorate as the investigation progressed, with medical professionals reporting that his psychological state was consistent with someone who had been carrying enormous guilt and traumatic memories for most of his adult life. The treatment team's assessment suggested that Tommy's emotional breakdown had been precipitated not just by the current investigation, but by years of accumulated stress related to his knowledge of or participation in whatever criminal activities had occurred. His doctors recommended intensive psychological treatment that would be necessary regardless of whatever legal proceedings might follow, treatment that would need to address both the immediate crisis and the long-term psychological damage that had resulted from his involvement in concealing serious crimes. Sarah Morrison's protective custody arrangement had been extended indefinitely as investigators worked to ensure her safety, while she continued to provide information crucial to understanding the full scope of whatever crimes had been committed. Her detailed knowledge of her family's behavioral patterns and her observations about changes in their routines had proven invaluable for establishing timelines and identifying potential evidence that might have been overlooked during the initial phases of the investigation. However, Sarah's isolation from her community and her awareness that her cooperation would result in the permanent destruction of her family relationships created ongoing emotional challenges that required professional counseling and support services. The legal proceedings surrounding Frank Morrison's case had attracted attention from prosecutors and defense attorneys throughout the region, many of whom recognized the case as presenting unique challenges related to the prosecution of crimes that had been concealed for such an extended period. The complexity of the evidence and the sophisticated nature of the concealment methods would require careful legal strategy and extensive preparation to ensure successful prosecution. Frank's defense team had begun developing arguments that would focus on the deterioration of evidence over time and the difficulties associated with proving criminal intent in cases where the defendant had maintained apparent normalcy for decades following the alleged criminal activity. The community's response to the ongoing investigation had evolved from initial shock and disbelief to a more complex mixture of emotions that included anger, betrayal, and a growing demand for complete transparency about whatever had been discovered. Local civic leaders found themselves in the difficult position of trying to maintain community cohesion while acknowledging the serious nature of the allegations against someone who had been a respected businessman and community member for decades. The investigation had forced residents to confront uncomfortable questions about their ability to judge character and their assumptions about the people they had trusted and respected for years. The media coverage of the investigation had expanded beyond local and regional outlets to include national television programs and magazines that specialized in true crime stories, creating additional pressure for investigators to balance public interest with the requirements of ongoing legal proceedings. Detective Santos had worked with public information specialists to develop a communication strategy that provided appropriate updates about the investigation's progress without compromising the integrity of the evidence or the rights of individuals involved in the case. The intense media attention had also created security concerns that required additional resources and careful coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies. The forensic reconstruction of the timeline surrounding Patricia Coleman's disappearance had been significantly enhanced by the evidence recovered from Morrison's scrapyard, allowing investigators to develop a much more detailed understanding of the sequence of events that had occurred during those crucial hours in June 1976. The physical evidence, combined with Sarah Morrison's detailed observations and the psychological profiles of the individuals involved, had created a comprehensive picture of the planning and execution of whatever criminal activities had taken place. However, the complete details of the reconstruction would not be available until all forensic analyses were completed and integrated into a coherent narrative that could be presented in court. The investigation's impact on Patricia Coleman's surviving family members had been profound, as they struggled to process the possibility that the mystery that had defined their lives for 18 years might finally be resolved through the revelation of criminal activity that had occurred within their own community. Patricia's elderly mother, who had moved to Millbrook to be closer to the investigation, had been provided with counseling services and regular updates about the case's progress. Her emotional response to the developments reflected both relief that answers might finally be available and anger about the years of uncertainty and grief that could have been avoided if the truth had been revealed earlier. The economic impact of the investigation on Morrison's auto repair and salvage had been immediate and comprehensive, with the business effectively shut down by the ongoing search activities and the legal proceedings against Frank Morrison. The facility's customers had been forced to find alternative sources for automotive repair and salvage services, creating ripple effects throughout the local economy that extended far beyond the immediate impact on Frank's business operations. The investigation had also raised questions about the environmental impact of the scrapyard's operations and the potential for contamination that might require extensive remediation efforts regardless of the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The collaboration between Detective Santos and federal law enforcement agencies had been necessitated by the complexity of the forensic analysis and the need for specialized expertise that was not available through local resources. The federal involvement had also provided additional legal tools and resources that were particularly valuable for cases involving evidence that had been concealed for extended periods. The multi-agency coordination required careful attention to jurisdictional issues and procedural requirements that could affect the admissibility of evidence and the prosecution strategies that would be employed in subsequent legal proceedings. The psychological evaluation of Sarah Morrison had been conducted to assess her emotional stability and her reliability as a witness, given the enormous personal stress she had experienced as a result of her decision to cooperate with the investigation. The evaluation had confirmed that Sarah's cooperation was motivated by genuine moral conviction rather than personal animosity or psychological instability, findings that would be important for establishing her credibility as a witness in subsequent legal proceedings. However, the evaluation had also revealed the significant emotional trauma that Sarah had experienced as a result of her discoveries about her family's activities and her decision to reveal those discoveries to authorities. The technical challenges associated with analyzing evidence that had been exposed to environmental conditions for 18 years had required the development of specialized procedures and the coordination of expertise from multiple forensic disciplines. The deterioration of organic materials and the potential contamination of physical evidence had created situations where traditional analytical methods were insufficient and required innovative approaches that pushed the boundaries of current forensic science capabilities. The investment in these specialized analytical procedures reflected the recognition that the case represented not only a crucial test of the justice system's ability to address historical crimes, but also an opportunity to advance forensic science techniques that could be applied to similar cases in the future. The preparation of charges against Frank Morrison had required extensive consultation with legal experts who specialized in cases involving historical crimes and complex evidence issues. The prosecution team had to balance the desire to file comprehensive charges that reflected the full scope of Frank's criminal activity with the practical requirements of proving those charges beyond a reasonable doubt, given the limitations imposed by the passage of time and the deterioration of evidence. The legal strategy that emerged from these consultations emphasized charges that could be supported by the strongest available evidence, while maintaining flexibility to address additional charges if further evidence became available through ongoing forensic analysis. The community healing process that would be necessary regardless of the investigation's outcome had already begun through the efforts of local religious and civic leaders who recognized that the revelation of criminal activity by respected community members would require extensive support services and collective processing of the trauma that such revelations created. The community's response to the investigation had revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities in the informal support systems that had developed over the years, highlighting the need for more formal mechanisms to address situations where community trust had been fundamentally compromised by criminal activity. The investigation's impact on law enforcement practices and procedures had been significant, with Detective Santos's methodical approach and innovative investigative techniques being studied by other departments facing similar cold cases. The collaboration between multiple agencies and the integration of traditional investigative methods with advanced forensic techniques had created a model for addressing complex historical crimes that could be applied to other unsolved cases. The documentation of these procedures and their effectiveness would contribute to the broader development of law enforcement capabilities for addressing crimes that had been concealed for extended periods. The psychological impact on community members who had known and trusted Frank Morrison for decades had been profound, forcing them to reconsider their understanding of human nature and their ability to judge character. The revelation that someone they had respected and trusted could have been concealing serious criminal activity for so many years challenged fundamental assumptions about community safety and interpersonal relationships. The counseling services that had been made available to community members reflected recognition that the investigation's impact extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings to include broader questions about trust, security, and the reliability of social institutions. The forensic analysis of electronic and documentary evidence recovered from Morrison's business and personal records had revealed patterns of behavior and decision-making that provided important insights into Frank's psychological state and his methods for concealing his criminal activities. The sophisticated record-keeping systems that Frank had maintained for his legitimate business operations had ironically provided investigators with detailed documentation of his activities and movements that could be cross-referenced with other evidence to establish comprehensive timelines and patterns. The analysis of these records had required specialized expertise in financial forensics and business operations analysis that complemented the physical evidence analysis being conducted by other specialists. The coordination between the investigation team and the legal system had been complicated by the need to balance the public's right to information with the requirements of ongoing legal proceedings and the protection of individual rights. The development of appropriate protocols for sharing information with the media and the community while maintaining the integrity of the investigation had required careful consideration of legal precedents and consultation with experts in media law and public information policy. The balance that had been achieved reflected both the legitimate public interest in understanding the investigation's progress and the equally legitimate need to protect the rights of all individuals involved in the legal proceedings. The investigations revelation of the sophisticated methods that Frank Morrison had employed to conceal his criminal activities had implications that extended beyond the immediate case to include broader questions about the detection and prevention of similar crimes. The techniques that Frank had used to hide evidence and maintain his public persona while concealing serious criminal activity provided important insights into the vulnerabilities of community-based detection systems and the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies in identifying and investigating crimes that were carefully concealed by individuals with specialized knowledge and resources. The ongoing support services that had been provided to Sarah Morrison reflected recognition that her cooperation with the investigation would have lasting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Her decision to reveal her family's secrets had required enormous courage and had resulted in the loss of her marriage, her relationship with her son, and her standing within the community that had been her home for decades. The comprehensive support services that had been arranged for Sarah included not only immediate counseling and protective services, but also longer-term assistance with housing, employment, and social integration that would be necessary for her to rebuild her life following the conclusion of the legal proceedings. The final phases of the forensic analysis had begun to produce definitive results that would form the foundation for the prosecution's case against Frank Morrison, results that confirmed many of the suspicions that had been developed during the investigation while also revealing additional details about the scope and nature of his criminal activities. The integration of these analytical results with the other evidence that had been gathered during the investigation was creating a comprehensive picture of the events that had occurred during Patricia Coleman's disappearance and the subsequent efforts to conceal those events. However, the complete details of these findings would not be revealed until the prosecution was ready to present its case in court, maintaining the integrity of the legal proceedings while ensuring that all parties had access to the evidence necessary for fair adjudication of the charges. The preparation for trial proceedings had required extensive coordination between prosecutors, investigators, and expert witnesses to ensure that the complex evidence would be presented in a manner that would be comprehensible to jurors while maintaining the scientific rigor necessary for legal acceptance. The challenge of presenting evidence that had been concealed for 18 years and analyzed using sophisticated forensic techniques would require careful attention to educational aspects of the presentation as well as the legal requirements for establishing chain of custody and scientific reliability. The prosecution team's approach emphasized clear, systematic presentation of the evidence that would allow jurors to understand both the technical aspects of the forensic analysis and the human story that the evidence revealed. The anticipation surrounding the eventual trial had created an atmosphere of tension and expectation throughout Millbrook and the surrounding region, with community members, media representatives, and legal professionals all waiting for the complete revelation of whatever had been discovered during the investigation. The careful control of information that had been maintained throughout the investigation had been necessary to protect the integrity of the legal proceedings, but it had also created a situation where speculation and rumors filled the information vacuum that official silence had created. The management of this situation required ongoing attention to communication strategies that would provide appropriate information while maintaining the legal and ethical standards necessary for fair adjudication of the charges. The psychological preparation of key witnesses, including Sarah Morrison, for their eventual testimony had required specialized counseling services that addressed both the emotional trauma associated with revealing family secrets and the practical challenges of testifying in high-profile legal proceedings. The witness preparation process had to balance the need for complete and accurate testimony with recognition of the enormous personal cost that such testimony would represent for individuals who had been forced to choose between family loyalty and moral obligation. The support services that had been developed for these witnesses reflected understanding that their cooperation was essential for achieving justice, but that such cooperation required comprehensive assistance to address the personal consequences of their decisions. The community's preparation for the eventual revelation of the investigation's findings had involved extensive consultation with mental health professionals, religious leaders, and civic organizations about the support services that would be necessary to help residents process whatever truth would be revealed about Patricia Coleman's disappearance. The recognition that the truth might be more disturbing than the uncertainty that had characterized the previous 18 years had motivated careful planning for community support services that could address the trauma and disillusionment that such revelations might create. The preparation process had also involved consideration of the long-term impact on community cohesion and trust that would need to be addressed through ongoing programs and initiatives. The final forensic reports began arriving in Detective Santos's office during the third week of October 1994, each document adding crucial pieces to the evidentiary puzzle that had been slowly assembled throughout the months of intensive investigation. The scientific analysis of materials recovered from Morrison's scrapyard had required the coordinated efforts of specialists from across the region, each contributing expertise in specific forensic disciplines that were necessary to analyze evidence that had been deliberately concealed and naturally deteriorated over nearly 2 decades. The complexity of the analytical process had challenged even experienced forensic scientists, requiring innovative techniques and careful interpretation of results that pushed the boundaries of what could be definitively established through scientific examination. Frank Morrison's legal team had been working frantically to develop defense strategies that could challenge the admissibility or interpretation of evidence that had been collected under such unusual circumstances, recognizing that the prosecution's case would rely heavily on forensic analysis of materials that had been exposed to environmental conditions for an extended period. The defense attorney's strategy focused on the inherent limitations of analyzing deteriorated evidence and the difficulties associated with establishing definitive conclusions about events that had occurred so many years earlier. However, their preliminary review of the prosecution's evidence had revealed the thoroughness and scientific rigor of the analysis, making it clear that any successful defense would require sophisticated technical arguments rather than simple challenges to investigative procedures. Sarah Morrison's emotional preparation for her eventual testimony had become the focus of intensive counseling and support services, as legal experts recognized that her credibility and emotional stability during cross-examination would be crucial factors in the prosecution's ability to present a compelling case. Sarah's decision to cooperate with the investigation had required her to violate fundamental principles of family loyalty and marital trust, decisions that had created psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate stress of participating in legal proceedings. The counseling process had helped Sarah understand that her moral obligation to seek justice for Patricia Coleman justified the personal costs she had incurred, but it could not eliminate the grief and guilt she felt about the destruction of her family relationships. Tommy Morrison's psychological treatment had progressed to the point where he was beginning to provide information about his role in the events surrounding Patricia's disappearance, information that was being carefully documented by mental health professionals working in coordination with legal authorities. Tommy's revelations were emerging slowly and often in fragmented form, as his psychological defenses gradually allowed him to confront memories and knowledge that he had been suppressing for nearly 2 decades. The treatment team's approach emphasized creating a safe environment for Tommy's disclosures while ensuring that any legally relevant information was properly documented and preserved for potential use in legal proceedings. The prosecution team had begun the complex process of organizing their evidence into a coherent narrative that would be comprehensible to jurors while maintaining the scientific accuracy necessary for legal acceptance. The challenge lay in presenting technical forensic evidence in a manner that would allow ordinary citizens to understand its significance without oversimplifying the analysis to the point where its conclusions could be successfully challenged by defense experts. The prosecution strategy emphasized the convergence of multiple types of evidence, including physical materials, behavioral observations, and circumstantial factors that together created a compelling case even when individual elements might be subject to some degree of scientific uncertainty. The community's emotional preparation for the eventual trial had involved extensive outreach. Efforts by mental health professionals and religious leaders who recognized that the revelation of the investigation's findings would create psychological challenges that extended throughout Millbrook's social fabric. The recognition that Patricia's disappearance had finally been solved through the revelation of criminal activity by respected community members represented both closure and betrayal, emotions that would be difficult for many residents to reconcile. The support services that had been organized reflected understanding that the community's healing process would require time and professional guidance to address the trauma that such revelations would create. Detective Santos had worked closely with federal forensic specialists to ensure that all evidence analysis met the highest scientific standards and could withstand the scrutiny that would inevitably be applied during trial proceedings. The detective's meticulous attention to procedural details and her coordination with experts from multiple disciplines had created a comprehensive evidentiary foundation that addressed every aspect of the case from multiple analytical perspectives. However, Detective Santos also understood that the strength of the scientific evidence would ultimately depend on the prosecution's ability to present it effectively and the jury's capacity to understand its significance within the context of the human story that the evidence revealed. The media attention surrounding the case had intensified as news of the investigation's progress spread throughout the region and beyond, attracting coverage from national news organizations that specialized in high-profile criminal cases and unsolved mysteries. The extensive media coverage had created additional pressure for all parties involved in the legal proceedings, as attorneys, investigators, and witnesses found themselves subject to public scrutiny that complicated their ability to focus on the legal and factual issues that would determine the case's outcome. Detective Santos and the prosecution team had developed careful media strategies that provided appropriate public information while protecting the integrity of the ongoing legal proceedings. The psychological evaluation of Frank Morrison had been updated as additional information became available through the investigation, revealing a personality profile that helped explain both his ability to maintain his deception for so many years and the psychological pressure that had ultimately led to behavioral changes that attracted investigative attention. The evaluation suggested that Frank possessed sophisticated planning abilities and an unusual capacity for compartmentalization, but also indicated that the stress of maintaining his secrets had created underlying psychological conditions that had affected his decision-making and behavior in subtle but observable ways. These psychological insights would be crucial for understanding the motivations and methods that had characterized Frank's criminal activities and his subsequent efforts to conceal them. The investigation's impact on Millbrook's business community had been significant, as the revelation that one of the town's most successful entrepreneurs had been concealing serious criminal activity raised questions about oversight and accountability within the local business environment. The closure of Morrison's auto repair and salvage had eliminated dozens of jobs and disrupted established relationships with customers and suppliers throughout the region, creating economic ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate impact on Frank's business operations. The situation had also prompted discussions about the need for enhanced monitoring and regulation of businesses that might be used to conceal criminal activity, discussions that reflected broader concerns about community safety and business ethics. Sarah Morrison's protective custody arrangements had been modified to provide her with greater freedom of movement while maintaining the security measures necessary to ensure her safety as the case progressed toward trial. The extended period of isolation had taken a significant psychological toll on Sarah, who found herself cut off from the community and social relationships that had provided meaning and support throughout her adult life. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated by moral conviction, but the personal costs of that decision continued to accumulate as she faced the prospect of testifying against her husband and potentially her son in proceedings that would be extensively covered by local and national media. The forensic reconstruction of Patricia Coleman's final day had been significantly enhanced by the evidence recovered from Morrison's scrapyard, allowing investigators to develop a detailed timeline of events that clarified many aspects of the case that had remained mysterious for 18 years. The physical evidence, combined with witness statements and behavioral analysis, had created a comprehensive picture of the interactions and decisions that had led to Patricia's disappearance. However, the complete details of this reconstruction remained confidential as prosecutors prepared their case, ensuring that the defense would not have advanced knowledge of the specific arguments and evidence that would be presented during trial proceedings, the legal precedents that would govern. The prosecution of Frank Morrison's case had required extensive research by both prosecution and defense teams, as the unusual circumstances of the case raised complex questions about evidence admissibility, witness reliability, and the standards of proof that would be applied to crimes that had been concealed for such an extended period. The legal arguments that would be presented during trial proceedings would likely influence future cases involving similar circumstances, making the case significant not only for the immediate parties involved, but also for the broader development of criminal law and procedure. The attorneys involved in the case recognized that their arguments and the court's decisions would be closely scrutinized by legal professionals throughout the region and beyond. The preparation of expert witnesses had required extensive coordination between prosecution attorneys and the various forensic specialists who had contributed to the evidence analysis, ensuring that each expert would be able to present their findings clearly and respond effectively to cross-examination by defense attorneys. The complexity of the forensic evidence meant that expert testimony would be crucial for helping jurors understand the significance of the physical materials that had been recovered and analyzed. The prosecution team's approach emphasized selecting experts who could communicate complex scientific concepts in accessible language while maintaining the precision and accuracy necessary for legal proceedings. The investigation's impact on Patricia Coleman's memory and legacy had been complex, as the approaching resolution of her case brought renewed attention to her life and career while also revealing the disturbing circumstances of her death. The community's understanding of Patricia had evolved from viewing her as a beloved teacher who had mysteriously disappeared to recognizing her as the victim of criminal activity that had been concealed by people she had trusted and tried to help. This evolution in understanding had prompted reflection about Patricia's dedication to her students and her willingness to provide extra assistance even when such efforts placed her in situations that ultimately proved dangerous. The economic analysis of Frank Morrison's business operations had revealed financial patterns and resource allocation decisions that were consistent with someone who had been using legitimate business activities to conceal criminal behavior. The analysis had identified expenditures and operational choices that seemed unusual for a typical automotive repair and salvage business. Expenditures that made more sense when viewed as investments in evidence concealment and security measures designed to prevent detection of criminal activities. These financial patterns provided additional circumstantial evidence that complemented the physical evidence recovered from the scrapyard and helped establish the premeditation and planning that had characterized Frank's criminal activities. The psychological impact on Tommy Morrison's treatment team had been significant, as the mental health professionals working with him struggled to balance their therapeutic obligations with their awareness that Tommy's disclosures might reveal information crucial to understanding serious criminal activities. The ethical considerations involved in treating someone who was both a victim of psychological trauma and a potential witness or co-defendant in criminal proceedings required careful consultation with legal and professional ethics experts. The treatment approach that had been developed emphasized Tommy's immediate psychological needs while ensuring that any legally relevant information was properly documented and preserved. The community's preparation for the eventual trial had involved careful consideration of the logistical challenges that would be created by intense media attention and public interest in the proceedings. Local officials had worked with court administrators to develop plans for managing crowd control, media access, and security concerns that would allow the legal proceedings to function effectively despite the extraordinary public attention they would attract. The planning process had also addressed the need for additional support services for community members who might be emotionally affected by the detailed revelation of criminal activities that had occurred within their town. The collaboration between Detective Santos and federal law enforcement agencies had been extended to include assistance with witness protection and trial security, reflecting recognition that the high-profile nature of the case and the potential for community disruption required resources beyond what local agencies could provide. The federal involvement had also facilitated access to specialized investigative techniques and analytical capabilities that had been crucial for processing evidence that had been concealed for such an extended period. The multi-agency coordination had created a model for addressing complex historical crimes that could be applied to similar cases in other jurisdictions. The investigation's documentation had been organized into comprehensive case files that would serve not only as the foundation for prosecution efforts, but also as a resource for law enforcement training and academic research into criminal investigation techniques. The systematic approach that had been employed throughout the investigation had created detailed records of every procedural step and analytical decision, documentation that would be valuable for understanding both the successes and challenges associated with investigating crimes that had been concealed for extended periods. The case files represented one of the most comprehensive documentations of a complex historical criminal investigation ever assembled by a small-town law enforcement agency. The psychological preparation of community members for the trial's revelations had involved extensive consultation with trauma specialists who understood the unique challenges associated with discovering that serious crimes had been committed by trusted community members. The recognition that the truth about Patricia's disappearance might be more disturbing than the uncertainty that had characterized the previous 18 years had motivated careful planning for support services that could address the disillusionment and betrayal that such revelations might create. The preparation process had emphasized the importance of community solidarity and mutual support during what would undoubtedly be a difficult period for all residents. The analysis of communications evidence, including phone records and written materials recovered from Morrison's property, had revealed patterns of behavior and decision-making that provided additional insights into the planning and execution of criminal activities. The sophisticated record-keeping systems that Frank had maintained for legitimate business purposes had inadvertently created detailed documentation of his activities and movements that could be cross-referenced with other evidence to establish comprehensive timelines and verify or contradict various aspects of witness statements. The communications analysis had required specialized expertise in telecommunications technology and business record analysis that complemented the physical evidence examination being conducted by forensic specialists. The preparation for victim impact statements had involved extensive consultation with Patricia Coleman's surviving family members, who were struggling to process not only the approaching resolution of the mystery that had defined their lives for 18 years, but also the disturbing details about the circumstances of Patricia's death that were emerging through the investigation. The family's emotional response to the investigation's findings reflected both relief that answers were finally available and anger about the years of uncertainty and grief that could have been avoided if the truth had been revealed earlier. The victim impact preparation process emphasized providing the family with opportunities to express their feelings while ensuring that their statements would be legally appropriate and emotionally sustainable. the investigation's impact on law enforcement practices had been significant, with other agencies studying Detective Santos's methodical approach and innovative investigative techniques as models for addressing their own cold cases. The integration of traditional investigative methods with advanced forensic techniques had created a comprehensive approach that could be adapted to various types of historical crimes. The success of the investigation had also highlighted the importance of community cooperation and the crucial role that insider information could play in solving cases that had resisted conventional investigative approaches for extended periods. The final phases of evidence analysis had begun to reveal the complete scope of the criminal activities that would be addressed during the trial, providing prosecutors with a comprehensive understanding of the charges that could be supported by available evidence. The integration of physical evidence, witness statements, psychological analysis, and circumstantial factors had created a compelling case that addressed not only the immediate criminal acts, but also the sophisticated planning and ongoing concealment efforts that had characterized the defendant's behavior for nearly 2 decades. However, the complete details of these findings would remain confidential until they were presented during trial proceedings, maintaining the integrity of the legal process while building anticipation throughout the community for the final revelation of the truth about Patricia Coleman's disappearance. The approaching trial date had created an atmosphere of expectation and anxiety throughout Millbrook and the surrounding region, as community members, legal professionals, and media representatives prepared for what promised to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in the area's history. The careful preparation that had characterized every aspect of the investigation was now being applied to trial preparation, with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court officials working to ensure that the complex case would be presented fairly and comprehensively despite the extraordinary public attention it would attract. The trial would represent not only the culmination of 18 years of investigation, but also a crucial test of the justice system's ability to address historical crimes and provide closure to communities that had been haunted by unsolved mysteries for extended periods. The trial proceedings were scheduled to begin on November 15, 1994, but the final revelation that would forever change Millbrook's understanding of Patricia Coleman's fate came 3 days earlier, when Detective Santos received the conclusive forensic report that confirmed what the investigation had been building toward for months. The scientific analysis had finally produced definitive results that eliminated any remaining uncertainty about what had been discovered beneath the carefully arranged concealment materials in the remote section of Morrison's scrapyard. The report, delivered in the clinical language of forensic science, described findings that would horrify the community and validate every suspicion that had motivated Sarah Morrison's agonizing decision to break her silence. The forensic specialists had worked with painstaking precision to document and analyze what Frank Morrison had spent 18 years desperately trying to hide from discovery. Beneath the layers of debris, rusted machinery, and carefully positioned salvage materials, investigators had uncovered Patricia Coleman's blue 1973 Chevrolet Chevelle, the distinctive vehicle that had disappeared with her on that June afternoon in 1976. The car had been methodically dismantled and concealed within a specially constructed underground chamber that demonstrated Frank Morrison's sophisticated understanding of evidence concealment and his determination to ensure that his crimes would never be discovered through conventional investigative methods. The condition of the vehicle and its contents revealed the horrifying truth about Patricia Coleman's final moments and the calculated cruelty of the man who had destroyed her life to protect his son's criminal activities. Patricia's remains, preserved by the controlled environment that Frank had created within the concealed chamber, provided forensic evidence that confirmed she had died from blunt force trauma consistent with a violent assault that had occurred elsewhere before her. Body and vehicle were transported to the scrapyard for concealment. The forensic analysis indicated that Patricia had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, injuries that would have caused immediate death and eliminated any possibility that she had survived the initial attack. The discovery of Patricia's personal belongings within the concealed vehicle provided additional evidence about the circumstances of her death and the premeditation that had characterized Frank Morrison's criminal activities. Her purse, containing identification and personal items that had remained undisturbed for 18 years, was found alongside her briefcase filled with student papers and teaching materials that she had been carrying when she left the school for the final time. The presence of these items, combined with the forensic evidence from the vehicle and Patricia's remains, created an irrefutable record of the crimes that Frank Morrison had committed and concealed for nearly 2 decades. The forensic reconstruction of events revealed that Patricia Coleman had not died in the school parking lot as Frank had later confessed, but rather in a confrontation that had occurred at Morrison's scrapyard after she had been lured thereunder. False pretenses related to concerns about Tommy's academic progress. The evidence suggested that Frank had contacted Patricia on the afternoon of her disappearance, convincing her to meet him at the scrapyard to discuss Tommy's future and the additional tutoring that would be necessary for his academic success. The isolation of the scrapyard location had provided Frank with the privacy necessary to confront Patricia about her discovery of Tommy's drug-dealing activities without fear of witnesses or interruption. The psychological analysis of Frank Morrison's behavior during the 18 years following Patricia's murder revealed the extraordinary planning and self-control that had been necessary to maintain his deception while living with the knowledge of what he had done. The evidence suggested that Frank had immediately recognized the necessity of concealing not only Patricia's body, but also her vehicle, understanding that the discovery of either would inevitably lead to his arrest and prosecution. His decision to create an elaborate underground concealment chamber demonstrated both his technical expertise and his commitment to ensuring that his crimes would remain hidden indefinitely. Tommy Morrison's role in the concealment activities had been more extensive than initially suspected, with evidence suggesting that he had participated in the construction of the underground chamber and had been aware of his father's criminal activities from the beginning. The psychological evaluation revealed that Tommy's knowledge of Patricia's murder and his participation in concealing the evidence had created the trauma and guilt that had characterized his behavior throughout his adult life. His complete emotional breakdown during the investigation had been precipitated not just by fear of discovery, but by years of accumulated psychological pressure related to his complicity in hiding the evidence of his tutor's murder, Sarah. Morrison's suspicions about her family's involvement in Patricia's disappearance had been based on behavioral observations that were now revealed to have been accurate assessments of their psychological responses to concealing serious criminal activity. Her decision to cooperate with the investigation had been motivated by a growing certainty that her husband and son possessed knowledge about Patricia's fate that they had concealed from investigators and the community. The discovery of Patricia's remains and the evidence of the elaborate concealment efforts validated Sarah's moral conviction that truth and justice required her to break the silence that had protected her family's secrets. The community's reaction to the revelation of Patricia's fate represented a complex mixture of relief, horror, and betrayal as residents struggled to process the discovery that their beloved teacher had been murdered by someone they had trusted and respected for decades. The news that Patricia's body had been hidden within Morrison's scrapyard for 18 years, concealed beneath materials that thousands of community members had unknowingly passed by during routine business transactions, created a sense of violation and complicity that would require extensive counseling and support services to address. The realization that Frank Morrison had maintained his public persona as a successful businessman and community member while harboring such a horrific secret challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and social relationships. Detective Santos's management of the case's conclusion required careful coordination with multiple agencies and specialists to ensure that all aspects of the discovery were properly documented and preserved for legal proceedings. The detective's 18-year investigation had finally achieved its objective of solving Patricia Coleman's disappearance, but the revelation of the brutal circumstances of her death created new challenges related to community trauma and media management. The detective's sense of professional satisfaction at solving the case was tempered by the recognition that the truth was even more disturbing than the speculation that had characterized the previous 18 years. The prosecution's case against Frank Morrison had been significantly strengthened by the discovery of Patricia's remains and the physical evidence that confirmed the premeditation and planning that had characterized his criminal activities. The elaborate concealment methods and the sophisticated underground chamber demonstrated that Frank's crimes had involved extensive preparation and ongoing maintenance efforts that continued for nearly 2 decades after Patricia's murder. The prosecution team's strategy emphasized the calculated nature of Frank's actions and his complete lack of remorse for destroying an innocent woman's life to protect his son's criminal activities. Frank Morrison's psychological evaluation following. The discovery of Patricia's remains revealed a man who experienced relief that his burden of secrecy was finally ending, combined with resignation about the consequences that would inevitably follow. His detailed confessions to investigators confirmed many aspects of the forensic reconstruction while also revealing additional details about his motivations and decision-making processes during the crucial hours surrounding Patricia's murder. Frank's admissions demonstrated that he had acted deliberately and with full awareness of the consequences of his actions, eliminating any possibility that his crimes could be attributed to temporary insanity or emotional disturbance. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of Patricia's remains moved swiftly through the court system, as Frank Morrison's detailed confessions and the overwhelming physical evidence eliminated any realistic possibility of mounting a successful defense. Frank's decision to plead guilty to first-degree murder charges reflected both his acceptance of responsibility for his crimes and his desire to avoid subjecting his family and the community to the trauma of a lengthy trial that would have required detailed testimony about the brutal circumstances of Patricia's death. His plea agreement included provisions for cooperation with ongoing investigations into Tommy's involvement and his commitment to providing complete information about all aspects of the concealment activities. Tommy Morrison's legal situation was complicated by his status as a minor at the time of Patricia's murder and his obvious psychological trauma related to his involvement in concealing the evidence. The prosecution's approach to Tommy emphasized rehabilitation and mental health treatment rather than purely punitive measures, recognizing that his participation in his father's crimes had been motivated by fear and family loyalty rather than independent criminal intent. Tommy's plea agreement included provisions for intensive psychological treatment and community service that would allow him to contribute to educational programs designed to prevent similar tragedies. Sarah Morrison's role as the key witness whose courage had finally brought justice for Patricia Coleman was recognized through formal commendations from law enforcement agencies and community organizations. However, Sarah's personal costs remained enormous, as her decision to reveal her family's secrets had resulted in the complete destruction of her marriage and her relationship with her son. The support services that had been arranged for Sarah included assistance with housing, employment, and social integration that would be necessary for rebuilding her life following the conclusion of the legal proceedings. The community's healing process began with a memorial service for Patricia Coleman that drew hundreds of participants who had been affected by her life and death. The service provided an opportunity for collective grieving and reflection about the values of truth, justice, and moral courage that Patricia's life had represented and that Sarah Morrison's difficult decision had ultimately vindicated. The establishment of expanded scholarship programs in Patricia's memory created lasting positive outcomes that honored her dedication to education while supporting future generations of students. The investigation's impact on law enforcement practices extended far beyond Millbrook, as agencies throughout the region studied Detective Santos's methodical approach and innovative techniques as models for addressing their own cold cases. The success of the investigation demonstrated the importance of persistence, community cooperation, and the integration of traditional investigative methods with advanced forensic techniques. The comprehensive documentation of the investigative process created valuable resources for training programs and academic research into criminal investigation methodology. The long-term consequences of the case included significant changes to business oversight and environmental monitoring procedures, designed to prevent the use of legitimate commercial operations to conceal criminal activities. The revelation that Morrison's scrapyard had been used to hide evidence for 18 years prompted regulatory reforms that enhanced inspection and accountability requirements for businesses that might be vulnerable to misuse by criminals seeking to dispose of evidence or conduct illegal activities. Patricia Coleman's legacy was ultimately defined not only by her dedication to teaching and her tragic death, but also by the moral courage that her memory inspired in Sarah Morrison and the justice that was finally achieved through the patient work of Detective Santos and the forensic specialists who refused to abandon the search for truth. The resolution of her case provided closure for her family and the community while demonstrating that even the most carefully concealed crimes would eventually be revealed through persistent investigation and the moral courage of individuals willing to choose justice over personal loyalty. The final chapter of Patricia Coleman's story was written not in the classroom, where she had dedicated her professional life to helping young people achieve their potential, but in a courtroom where the truth about her death finally emerged after 18 years of concealment and deception. The justice that was achieved could not restore Patricia's life or eliminate the years of grief that her family and friends had endured, but it provided the closure and accountability that were necessary for healing and moving forward. The case stands as a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage in confronting evil, even when that confrontation requires enormous personal sacrifice and the destruction of fundamental relationships and loyalties.